Hi, welcome to Polyphonic Press. I'm Jeremy Boyd, and today I'm going to be reviewing the self-titled album by the Beatles, otherwise known as the White Album. By the end of 1967, the Beatles had stopped touring altogether. They had released perhaps their most iconic album with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Their manager, Brian Epstein, had died of a drug overdose, and they had their first major flop with Magical Mystery Tour. So, where do you go from here? Well, they decided to take a 2-month trip to India. In the summer of 1967, they spent time with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who had been visiting England. So between February and April of 1968, the Beatles, along with their respective girlfriends and wives, went to Rishikesh, India, where they studied transcendental meditation. While taking this course with the Maharishi, they wrote over 40 songs, and this batch of songs became the basis for their next studio effort. This, of course, became the White Album, and the album packaging only features a blank white canvas with the Beatles logo in the lower right-hand corner. The idea behind this cover is for the listener to only focus on the music and to not be distracted by the visual element that came along with all of their other releases. Whereas Sgt. Pepper was a very visual album, with the sleeve with all of the different faces on it and all the colorful costumes that they were wearing, this is a stark contrast to that and almost a rejection of that concept. With Sgt. Pepper being sort of a concept album, this is the White Album is sort of an anti-concept album. It's sort of a getting back to their roots as a rock and roll band. Sgt. Pepper was the peak of their psychedelic period. They spent months and months in the studio experimenting with different sounds and really making up sounds that no one had heard before on songs like the masterpiece, which is The Day in the Life, with that orchestra going up into the crescendo, and the spacey sounds that you hear on Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Sgt. Pepper was very much influenced by their use of LSD at the time. Though they didn't partake in the studio, the effects of the drug were still very present when they were recording the album and in the songwriting. But with the White Album and going to India and dabbling in transcendental meditation, they had the clarity of mind to get back to their roots as a rock and roll band without any psychedelic influence. But really, once you have a psychedelic experience, you kind of can't go back to the way you were. So they were trying to get back to their roots, but with the wisdom that came with experimenting with mind-altering substances. Because they had so many songs that needed to get done by the album's release date, they had multiple studios running at the same time. And George Martin was trying to divide his time between each studio and trying to give guidance to each recording session. But because of this, the Beatles for the first time were on their own, so to speak. So in one studio you had John Lennon recording one of his songs, while Paul was in another studio recording one of his, and George was in another studio recording his songs. So you had a lot of independence within the group, and this was really the first sign that the Beatles were going in their own directions. You can hear it in the music as well. John Lennon was mostly concerned with getting back to being a rock and roll band and sort of getting back to his blues roots with songs like Your Blues and Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey. The latter of those songs was a result of Lennon getting to go in a helicopter ride with the Maharishi, and that's a bit of advice or a bit of wisdom that he shared with John. He said, you know, everybody's got a secret, everybody's got something to hide. And John Lennon took that for a song title and added Except Me and My Monkey. His ballads on the album are pretty endearing as well, very much like the song Julia, which is about his mother who had died when John was 14 years old. Dear Prudence is about Mia Farrow's sister Prudence. Mia Farrow and her sister accompanied the Beatles to India, and for the most of the 2 months, she basically spent her time only in her room. She didn't only come out to eat, I think, and as the story goes. And so John wrote a song, was like, you know, come out and join and have a good time with us. But I think she was mostly focused on trying to get in touch with her spiritual side and get in touch with and practice the meditation that they had been taught. John Lennon's political side started to show on this album as well. The song Revolution 1, which is the same song as Revolution, and it's only slowed down a little bit, is about the political landscape going on in the late 1960s, about Vietnam and things like that. Paul McCartney's contributions on this album were a mixed bag of sorts. You see him expanding his Rodgers and Hammerstein style of writing with things like Martha My Dear and Honey Pie. But after receiving much criticism for this style of songwriting, especially from John Lennon, who called it granny songs, he wanted to prove that he could still write a good rock and roll tune. And he came up with Back in the USSR, which was heavily inspired by Chuck Berry, and some of the harmonies were very much influenced by early Beach Boys records. He also wrote Helter Skelter, which was a response to Pete Townsend, who said in an interview that The Who had come up with the loudest, dirtiest, heaviest song that they had recorded. And not to be outdone, Paul McCartney decided to one-up The Who and come up with a dirty, heavy song on his own. And the band recorded several takes of this song, and they were instructed to play as loud and hard and fast as they possibly could, to the point where at the end of one of the takes, Ringo screamed, "I got blisters on my fingers!" Paul McCartney is one of those songwriters who is able to piece together a song and to know exactly what he's doing, whereas John Lennon writes more intuitively and sort of just comes up with stuff. They're two very different songwriters, and yet they both somehow work really well together. I also really feel that George Harrison came into his own as a songwriter on this album. Obviously, the standout for me for George's songs is While My Guitar Gently Weeps. The beautiful lyrics paired with Eric Clapton's amazing guitar work really make this a standout, not only on this album, but in the Beatles' entire catalog. I really think it's one of their best songs, and it's a little darker and a little more serious than a lot of other Beatles songs, but it's just such a beautiful song. I actually think this is a better song than Something, which is also one of George Harrison's best. I think, honestly, this is one of probably his best Beatles song. I know everyone loves Something and Here Comes the Sun, but I don't know, I have to go with While My Guitar Gently Weeps. It's hard to pick a favorite song on this album because everything is so eclectic and diverse, but this is probably my favorite. The song Piggies was inspired by George Orwell's book Animal Farm, and John Lennon was always seen as the more political of the Beatles, whereas George Harrison was the more spiritual one, getting into Hinduism and Eastern religions, but he wasn't afraid to show his political side as well. And the song Piggies is kind of about consumerism and how people will buy things without really thinking about it, which, if you can imagine, that song was written in the 60s, and now it's only gotten worse. So I think lyrically that song is more relevant now than it was when it first came out. He also wrote Savoy Truffle, which was his attempt to distance himself from the image that had been built up as the spiritual Beatle. And much like Paul McCartney not wanting to be seen as a lame songwriter, George Harrison wanted to prove that he could just write a fun pop song, and that's the purpose of Savoy Truffle. And, to that purpose, it definitely works. It's a fun song, and it kind of cuts the tension of a lot of the seriousness of his contributions. The recording sessions for the White Album came at a time when tensions were very high within the group, and it even got to the point where Ringo actually left the band for 2 weeks. He was eventually persuaded to come back, but it had led him to be absent from a couple of the songs, and Paul McCartney had to fill in for him on the drums. This is actually the first Beatles album where a composition written by Ringo appears. The song Don't Pass Me By is kind of like a fun, sort of psychedelic country song. It's very cool to hear this, and it's very much Ringo's sense of humor, and his personality really shines through on this. And I get the sense that Ringo is he's the Beatle that likes to have a good time, which is very evident in things like A Hard Day's Night, where his scene where he's on the beach is a result of him out partying all night. And Ringo's just, I've never met the guy, but he just seems like a fun guy to be around. Because there are 30 songs on this album, there are definitely going to be a few songs that I don't really care for. The first one is probably Wild Honey Pie. I heard that they initially weren't going to include this on the album, but Patty, George Harrison's wife, really liked it, and so they kept it on the album. And to be honest, I think they should have listened to their instincts and left it off the album. It just feels like a spark of an idea for a song, not really a full song, and it just doesn't really go with the album, in my opinion. I just don't find it necessary to be there. Another one is Why Don't We Do It in the Road. I think this is an incomplete song. It sounds like a demo. It sounds like the result of recording a writing session. Doesn't feel like a complete song, and it's not really. It's just an idea for a song, and it just, I don't know why it's there. I'm not one of these people who loves everything that the Beatles do, and I'm not one of these people who criticizes the Beatles for things that hates the Beatles or anything like that. I try to look at it objectively and what fits with the album and what makes the album work. And these two songs just feel like incomplete works. In contrast to that, a song that is a complete work that I don't think fits on the album, or any album really, is Revolution 9. And I know I'm not the only person who feels this way. It's sort of an avant-garde piece. It's not really a song. It's just a piece of noise, really, with the person saying number 9 over and over. A lot of people think it's John Lennon. It's not. It's from a tape to test the equipment at EMI Studios, and it has a person on it saying numbers, number 1, number 2, number 3, and they just looped the guy saying number 9, number 9, number 9 over and over and over again. A lot of people think it's John Lennon. It's not. That's where that number 9 comes from. John Lennon was obsessed with the number 9. He was born on October 9th. That was his number. And it's interesting to know that from a historical point of view, but as an album, as a song to include on an album, it just doesn't work. It simply doesn't. When I was ripping all of my Beatles CDs to my iTunes library, this is the only song I didn't include. I don't have it on my iTunes. I don't plan on having it on my iTunes. This is the only Beatles song I flat out don't like. That's not to say I don't like this album, but it's just impossible to have an album with 30 songs on it and not to have a few blemishes. I think if someone were unfamiliar with the Beatles, this would probably be the album that I would introduce them to. Because it really showcases all of the different styles that the Beatles can do, and really gives them a picture of who the Beatles really are. Going into this review, I always had it in the back of my mind that Rubber Soul was my favorite Beatles album, and I think it still is. But I always felt that the White Album was just too big, too long. It's a double album, doesn't need to be a double album, but having listened to the whole thing from front to back, going into this review, I really can't say that it should be a single album. I can't pick and choose what songs should and shouldn't be on it. Other than the few that I mentioned, I really understand why they put out so many songs, and there certainly are certain songs that some are better than others, but really the album just, if you take one piece of the album away, it's not the White Album anymore. And I think you can say that it should be a single album, and you can make an argument with that, but nobody can really agree on what songs should be taken out, what should be left in. So I think it should stay a double album. And Paul McCartney said, because it's got so much on it, is one of the cool things about it. And I have to say I agree. 30 songs, and you can, if you want, you can skip them, the ones that you don't like. And even songs like Good Night, which is kind of cheesy with Ringo singing it, it has a certain charm to it. Like I said, this was sort of the beginning of the end of the Beatles. Like I said, they were having huge tensions in the studio, but really this was them trying to recapture their days as a rock and roll band. It's a stark contrast to their previous effort, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and they really wanted to do something that was more stripped down, and more of a basic rock and roll album. And I really think that they achieved that, but also incorporating what they learned in the studio with Sgt. Pepper and incorporating some of those elements, but not making an all-out studio project. That's my take on the White Album. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Take it easy.